Desmond Clarke stood in the boardroom, 30 minutes after being dragged off the flight. Bruises darkened his wrists. His vest hung torn at the shoulder. He stared directly into the video screen, locking eyes with the airline CEO. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You just destroyed a $52 billion deal." The room froze. No one could believe what had just happened would change American aviation forever. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe nobody should ever be treated this way, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this story will leave you speechless. Trust me, you need to hear every single word of what happens next. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Desmond Clarke was 45 years old and stood at the top of his game. As CEO of Clarke Aviation Technologies, he ran one of America's most innovative companies, specializing in AI navigation systems and environmentally friendly jet engines. His company was worth $87 billion, and he personally owned 32% of the shares. But Desmond's journey to the top had been anything but easy. Born in Detroit to a mechanic father and a nurse mother, he grew up watching his parents work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Scholarships rejected him multiple times because of his skin color, forcing him to work 3 jobs himself to pay for MIT. He spent 15 years building his company from a garage into a billion-dollar empire, facing racism at every turn. Investors doubted him, competitors dismissed him, banks refused him loans, but Desmond never quit. On this particular Monday morning, Desmond sat in Chicago's O'Hare Airport, preparing to board SkyLink Airlines Flight 447 to New York. He had booked his first-class seat 3 weeks in advance, seat 2A, for $7,000. The meeting waiting for him in Manhattan was the most important of his career. At 11 o'clock that morning, he was scheduled to sign a contract purchasing 52% of SkyLink Airlines for $52 billion. His plan was revolutionary. He would modernize the entire fleet with AI technology that cut fuel costs in half, transforming SkyLink into America's first truly green airline. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley had investors ready. The board was assembled. Everything was perfect. If he missed this meeting, the deal would fall apart and go to a Chinese competitor instead. Desmond wore a gray Armani suit, carried a black leather briefcase, and checked his Patek Philippe watch as he walked through security. He felt the familiar weight of suspicious stares following him through the terminal. Security officers looked at him longer than necessary. Other passengers clutched their bags tighter when he passed. He had felt these looks his entire life. In every expensive store he entered, every corporate office he walked into, every neighborhood he drove through. Being successful and black in America meant constantly proving you belonged in spaces others assumed were not for you. But today was different. Today, he held the future of an entire airline in his hands. At the gate, Desmond sat reviewing emails from his lawyer and CFO while watching other passengers board. White passengers in business casual walked onto the plane without a second glance from gate agents. Nobody stopped them. Nobody questioned their tickets. Nobody asked for additional identification. But when Desmond's row was called and he approached the gate, the agent, a woman named Gretchen Hayes, paused. She looked at his ticket, then at him, then back at the ticket. She called over a colleague. They whispered. Desmond felt his stomach tighten. He knew that feeling. Something was wrong. Bryce Callahan, the head flight attendant, appeared moments later. He was 42 years old with cold blue eyes and a thin smile that never reached them. He looked Desmond up and down slowly, deliberately, as if cataloging every detail to find something wrong. April Brennan, the passenger assigned to seat 2B, watched from behind with visible irritation, tapping her foot impatiently. The air grew thick with tension. Desmond checked his watch again. 9:15. He needed to board now, or risk missing his connection time to prepare for the meeting. He handed his boarding pass to Gretchen with a polite smile, but she barely looked at it before shaking her head. Bryce stepped forward and said in a tone that was polite on the surface, but cold underneath, "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again." Desmond handed it over, asking calmly if there was a problem. Bryce studied it far longer than necessary before looking up. "There's been a mistake. This seat belongs to another passenger. You'll need to move to economy." Desmond felt confusion wash over him. He pulled out his phone, opening the confirmation email, sent 3 weeks ago, clearly showing seat 2A, reserved under his name. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. Here's my confirmation." Bryce glanced at the phone screen for barely a second before handing it back. "I don't care what your phone says, sir. Company policy requires you to move." Desmond kept his voice level, professional, controlled. "Can I speak with the captain, please?" Bryce's smile vanished entirely. "You're delaying the flight, sir. Just move to your new seat and we can take off." Around them, other passengers began to shift uncomfortably. A white man in his 50s called out, "Come on, man. Just sit down so we can leave." April Brennan leaned toward the passenger beside her and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "I don't know how he even afforded first class." Desmond felt heat rise in his chest but forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper would only confirm their assumptions about him. He was a successful CEO, not a threat. But in their eyes, his success didn't matter. Only his skin color did. Bryce called Gretchen onto the plane. Together, they stood over Desmond's seat, flipping through paperwork that Desmond couldn't see, whispering to each other while occasionally glancing at him with thinly veiled suspicion. Gretchen finally said, "There's been a system error. We need you to move to seat 24C in economy." Desmond kept his breathing steady. "Mom, with respect, I paid $7,000 for this seat. I have every right to sit here." Gretchen's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Company policy gives us the right to reassign seats when necessary." Desmond asked what made it necessary in this case. Neither Bryce nor Gretchen answered. Other passengers grew restless. A woman called out, "Can we just take off already? This is ridiculous." A man in his 30s shook his head and muttered, "Always something." Nobody questioned why the flight crew was targeting Desmond. Nobody asked to see their supposed system error. They simply wanted him to comply so they could leave. Desmond felt the familiar sting of invisibility, of being reduced to an inconvenience rather than treated as a human being with rights. He called his assistant, Shauna Porter, asking her to resend the confirmation email. Within 30 seconds, it arrived. He showed it to Bryce, pointing at the clear reservation for seat 2A under Desmond Clarke's name, dated 3 weeks prior. Bryce looked at the email for perhaps 2 seconds before handing the phone back. "I already told you, sir. I don't care what your phone says." His tone had shifted from cold politeness to barely concealed hostility. Desmond felt his patience fraying, but kept his voice measured. "Then please explain to me why I can't sit in the seat I paid for." Bryce leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Desmond could hear. "Because I say so." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. This wasn't about tickets or system errors. This was about power. This was about a white flight attendant deciding that a black man, no matter how successful, didn't belong in first class. A black passenger named Luther Hayes, sitting in seat 5C, stood up. "Excuse me, but he showed you his ticket. Why are you still bothering him?" Bryce turned toward Luther with the same cold expression. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Stay in your seat, or you'll be removed as well." Luther sat down slowly, shaking his head in disgust, but unwilling to risk his own removal. Desmond appreciated the support but knew it wouldn't change anything. The system was designed to protect people like Bryce, not people like him. Bryce pulled out a radio and spoke into it quietly. Moments later, he announced, "We've called airport security. They'll help resolve this situation." Desmond's stomach dropped. "You're calling security on me for sitting in my assigned seat?" Bryce's smile returned, thin and cruel. "You're being disruptive, sir. We have the right to remove disruptive passengers." Desmond looked around at the other passengers, hoping someone would speak up, would point out the absurdity of what was happening, but most avoided his eyes. A few nodded in agreement with Bryce. April Brennan said loudly, "Finally. Maybe now we can leave on time." Desmond thought about his meeting in New York. He checked his watch. 9:28. He still had time if they could just resolve this quickly. He decided to stay calm, stay seated, and wait for security to arrive, so he could explain the situation to someone with more authority than a flight attendant on a power trip. But deep down, he knew how these situations usually ended. He had seen the videos. He had read the stories. Black men removed from planes. Black families kicked off flights. Black passengers humiliated, arrested, assaulted for doing nothing wrong. He had just never imagined it would happen to him. Not now. Not when he was this close to the biggest deal of his life. 2 security officers boarded the plane. One was a stocky white man named Kyle Drayton. The other was Marcus Flynn, slightly taller with a shaved head and an expression of practiced indifference. They walked directly to Desmond without asking any questions. Kyle said, "Sir, you need to come with us." Desmond stood slowly, gathering his briefcase. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I have my boarding pass right here, showing this is my assigned seat." Kyle didn't look at the boarding pass. "Just step off the plane, sir, and we'll sort this out." Desmond nodded, following them toward the exit, believing that once they were off the plane, away from the watching passengers, he could explain everything and get back on board in time. He had no idea how wrong he was. As Desmond walked toward the plane's exit, Kyle suddenly grabbed his arm. Not gently, not as a guide, but with force, fingers digging into Desmond's bicep hard enough to hurt. Desmond jerked in surprise. "What are you doing?" Kyle's voice came out harsh and commanding. "Stop resisting." Desmond's mind reeled with confusion. "I'm not resisting. I'm walking with you." But Kyle wasn't listening. He gripped tighter, twisting Desmond's arm backward. Marcus moved to Desmond's other side, grabbing his other arm. Together, they began pulling him toward the exit faster than Desmond could keep his footing. Passengers pulled out their phones. Camera flashes reflected off the cabin walls. Desmond heard the clicks and beeps of recording starting. April Brennan's voice rang out, shrill and dramatic. "Oh my God, he's fighting them." But Desmond wasn't fighting anyone. He was simply trying to keep his balance as 2 grown men dragged him forward. His briefcase fell from his hand. Marcus kicked it aside carelessly, and it skidded under a seat. "My briefcase," Desmond said, trying to turn back. Kyle shoved him against the cabin wall, and Desmond felt pain explode across his shoulder where it hit the hard surface. Marcus wrenched Desmond's arm behind his back, twisting it up between his shoulder blades. The pain was immediate and searing. Desmond cried out, "You're hurting me. I didn't do anything." Kyle leaned in close, his breath hot against Desmond's ear. "Stop yelling. You're making a scene." The irony would have been laughable if Desmond weren't in so much pain. They were the ones making a scene. They were the ones using excessive force on a man who had done nothing but sit in his assigned seat. But in their minds, he was the problem. His blackness was the disruption. His presence in first class was the crime. Luther Hayes stood again, shouting over the commotion. "This is wrong. He didn't do anything. You're assaulting him." Bryce pointed at Luther. "Sit down now, or you'll be next." Luther remained standing for a moment longer, filming on his phone, before slowly sinking back into his seat. Another passenger, a young white woman named Ingrid Fleming, was also recording, tears streaming down her face. She would later post the video to Twitter with the caption, "Black man being dragged off SkyLink flight for no reason." Within minutes, it would begin going viral. Kyle and Marcus pulled Desmond into the jetway. His feet barely touched the ground. When they did, his knees buckled, and he fell forward. His kneecap cracked against the hard floor, sending fresh waves of pain through his leg. Kyle hauled him back up by his collar, tearing the fabric of Desmond's vest. The rip sounded loud in the enclosed space. Desmond felt humiliation wash over him in waves. This was worse than pain. This was degradation. This was being treated like garbage, like a criminal, like he was less than human, all while wearing a torn $1,000 suit. At the gate, Desmond tried one more time. "Please, officers, I'm Desmond Clarke, CEO of Clarke Aviation Technologies. I have a meeting in New York in 90 minutes. Please, just check the system. Check my identification. This is a mistake." Kyle laughed. Actually laughed. "Sure you are. And I'm the president." Marcus smirked. "Stop lying, man. It'll only make things worse for you." Desmond felt despair crash over him. They didn't believe him. No matter what he said, no matter what he showed them, they had already decided who he was. A liar. A troublemaker. A black man who didn't know his place. They took him to a small security room deep in the terminal. The walls were gray concrete. The furniture consisted of a metal table and 2 chairs that looked like they belonged in an interrogation room. Kyle pointed at one of the chairs. "Sit." Desmond sat, every muscle in his body aching. His shoulder throbbed. His wrist was already swelling where Kyle had gripped it. His knee felt like it might be bleeding under his torn pants. Marcus stood by the door while Kyle sat across from Desmond. "We're gonna need to see some ID." Desmond reached slowly into his jacket pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements. He pulled out his driver's license, his passport, and his company ID card clearly stating his name and title, Desmond Clarke, Chief Executive Officer, Clarke Aviation Technologies. Kyle looked at them briefly, then slid them back across the table. "Anyone can fake these." Desmond stared at him in disbelief. "My passport? You think I faked a passport?" Marcus spoke from the doorway. "Seen it before." They hadn't. They were lying. But what could Desmond do? Who would believe him over them? He asked for his phone and briefcase so he could call his lawyer. Kyle refused. "Not until we verify who you are." Desmond felt his control slipping. "I have rights. You can't hold me without cause." Marcus crossed his arms. "You were disruptive on a flight. That's cause enough." Outside, Desmond could hear raised voices, footsteps running. Someone was shouting his name. But he couldn't tell who. He checked the clock on the wall. 10, 15, 45 minutes until his meeting. He had missed his flight. The deal was falling apart, and he was trapped in this room with 2 men who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be contained. Then the door burst open. Jasper Thornton stormed into the security room like a hurricane. At 43 years old, he stood 6'3", his navy blue 3-piece suit immaculate despite his obvious rush through the airport. As Desmond's chief legal counsel and closest friend since their MIT days, Jasper had seen this story play out too many times. He had lived it himself. He knew exactly what was happening the moment he saw the Twitter video that was now approaching 200,000 views. His eyes found Desmond immediately, taking in the torn vest, the bruised wrists, the haunted look in his friend's eyes. "Des," he said, his voice softer than Desmond had ever heard it. Desmond looked up, relief flooding through him. "They dragged me off, Jas." In front of everyone, Jasper placed a hand on Desmond's shoulder, before turning to face Kyle and Marcus with an expression that could freeze fire. "On what grounds are you holding my client?" Kyle straightened, suddenly less confident. He was disruptive on the flight. Jasper's laugh was sharp and humorless. Disruptive how, exactly? He sat in his assigned seat. "That's called following the rules, not breaking them." Marcus stepped forward. The crew felt threatened. Jasper pulled out his phone, pulling up the video that Ingrid Fleming had posted. He turned the screen toward the officers. "This video shows a man sitting quietly while being verbally harassed by your flight crew. Please point out the threatening behavior." Kyle and Marcus exchanged glances. Kyle tried again. "We were following orders." Jasper's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "Whose orders?" "I want names. I want written reports. I want documentation of every single decision that led to my client being assaulted and illegally detained." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "We don't have reports yet. We're waiting for instructions from our supervisor." Jasper pulled out a business card, placing it deliberately on the table. "My card. You have 2 hours to produce documentation or I'm filing charges for assault, false imprisonment, violation of civil rights, and about 15 other offenses I can think of off the top of my head. And gentlemen," he leaned forward, "I never lose." Desmond's phone, which Kyle had confiscated, began buzzing repeatedly on the table. Jasper picked it up, scrolling through notifications. His expression darkened. He showed Desmond the screen. Messages from the CFO. "Meeting postponed. Investors are furious. What happened?" Messages from SkyLink's board. "We need to speak immediately." Messages from Goldman Sachs. "Reconsidering our position." Each notification was another piece of the deal crumbling. Desmond closed his eyes. $52 billion. 15 years of work. Gone in less than an hour. "Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you think what happened to Desmond was completely unacceptable, comment number 1 right now. If you've ever faced discrimination yourself, comment number 2. And if you believe SkyLink Airlines should be held accountable, smash that like button and subscribe, because what happens next is going to shock you. Should Desmond sue? Should he walk away? Or should he do something nobody sees coming? Keep watching to find out. The security supervisor, Vincent Palmer, appeared in the doorway. He was a thin man in his 60s, with gray hair and the defeated posture of someone who knew he was about to deal with a massive lawsuit. "Mr. Clarke, I apologize for the misunderstanding. You're free to go." Jasper didn't move. "Too late for apologies, Mr. Palmer. Well, see you in court." Desmond stood slowly, every muscle protesting. He picked up his IDs, sliding them back into his torn jacket. He looked at Kyle and Marcus, holding their gazes until both men looked away. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. They knew they had crossed a line. They knew there would be consequences. Jasper guided Desmond out of the security room, through the terminal, and toward the private aviation section. "I already booked a jet. We'll be in New York in 90 minutes. Desmond glanced back one last time at the SkyLink Airlines gate, where Flight 447 had departed 10 minutes earlier. Jasper noticed the look. "What are you thinking?" Desmond's voice was quiet but filled with something Jasper had never heard before. Not anger. Not defeat. Something colder. More dangerous. "I'm thinking. I'm going to make them regret this for the rest of their corporate existence." The private jet hummed quietly as it cut through the clouds toward New York. Desmond sat by the window, watching the landscape blur below, feeling disconnected from his own body. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kyle's hands grabbing him, felt Marcus twisting his arm, heard April Brennan's voice saying he didn't belong. Jasper sat across from him, laptop open, typing furiously as emails and messages continued flooding in. The video had now reached 500,000 views. #boycott SkyLink was trending third nationally. Major news outlets were picking up the story. CNN, MSNBC. Even Fox News, though their coverage questioned whether Desmond had somehow provoked the situation. Desmond's CFO, Ramona Fletcher, appeared on a video call, her usually composed face tight with worry. "Desmond, our stock is down 3%. Investors are panicking because of the video." Desmond frowned. "The video proves I was treated unjustly. Why would they panic?" Ramona sighed. "They're worried the SkyLink deal is dead. If it falls through, we lose our chance to expand into commercial aviation. That's billions in projected revenue gone." Desmond felt anger flare. "So they're more concerned about money than the fact that I was assaulted." Ramona hesitated. "I'm just telling you what they're saying." Another call came in, this one from Franklin Ames, the 62-year-old CEO of SkyLink Airlines. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expression carefully neutral in a way that corporate executives practiced for decades. "Mr. Clarke, I'm deeply sorry about what happened. We're conducting a full investigation." Desmond's voice came out flat. "Did you watch the video, Mr. Ames?" Franklin nodded. "I did." Desmond leaned forward. "Then you saw your employees drag me off a plane for sitting in my assigned seat because I'm black." Franklin's neutral expression cracked slightly. "I don't believe this was about race. It was a misunderstanding." Desmond felt something snap inside him. "A misunderstanding? Your flight attendant called security on me for sitting down. Your security officers assaulted me on camera. Your gate agent refused to check my confirmation. But sure, let's call it a misunderstanding." Franklin tried to respond, but Desmond continued. "Tell me, Mr. Ames, how many white passengers have been dragged off your flights this year?" "How many?" Franklin was silent. "That's what I thought. We're done here." Desmond ended the call. Jasper looked up from his laptop. "Goldman Sachs just pulled out. They sent an email saying they don't want to be associated with racial controversy." Desmond laughed bitterly. "I'm the victim, and they're worried about controversy." Jasper nodded. "Morgan Stanley is reconsidering too. The SkyLink board wants to postpone negotiations indefinitely." Desmond stood, pacing the small cabin. Everything he had worked for was disintegrating because he had dared to sit in a seat he paid for while being black. The absurdity of it made him want to scream. But screaming wouldn't fix anything. Desmond forced himself to think strategically. If SkyLink didn't want him as a partner, fine. He would become their worst nightmare instead. "Jas, get me a meeting with Apex Capital Group. Today." Jasper raised an eyebrow. "Sterling Vaughan's firm." Desmond nodded. Sterling was another black CEO who had faced similar discrimination throughout his career. If anyone would understand, it would be him. Jasper made the call while Desmond stared out the window, formulating a plan that would change everything. The jet landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey 90 minutes later. A car was waiting to take them into Manhattan. Desmond ignored the throbbing in his shoulder, the ache in his wrist, the pain in his knee. Physical pain was temporary. What mattered now was making sure nobody else ever experienced what he just had. They arrived at Apex Capital Group's offices in Midtown. Sterling Vaughan met them personally, his expression grim as he shook Desmond's hand carefully, noting the bruises. "I saw the video. I'm so sorry, brother." Desmond appreciated the empathy, but moved quickly to business. "I need your help destroying SkyLink Airlines." Sterling gestured them into his office, closing the door. "Tell me what you need." Desmond laid out his plan. Instead of buying into SkyLink, he would partner with their competitors: United Airlines, Delta Airlines, American Airlines. He would provide them with Clarke Aviation Technologies' cutting-edge AI systems, making them more efficient and cheaper to operate than SkyLink. He would make SkyLink obsolete. Sterling listened carefully, then smiled slowly. "I love it. How much do you need? Desmond named a figure. $3 billion for immediate expansion of manufacturing capabilities. Sterling didn't hesitate. Done. I'm in. They shook hands, and Desmond felt something shift. Not relief, not satisfaction, but purpose. Desmond's phone buzzed. A message from Franklin Ames. Mr. Clarke, can we talk? I'm willing to make this right. Desmond showed the message to Jasper. What do you think? Jasper shrugged. Your call. Desmond typed a response. Too late. He sent it and turned off his phone. There was work to do. 3 hours after being dragged off the plane, Desmond stood before 50 reporters in a conference room at the Roosevelt Hotel. Cameras flashed. Microphones crowded the podium. Every major news outlet had sent someone. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, even international press from BBC and Reuters. Jasper stood to the side, watching his friend with pride and concern. Desmond still wore his torn vest. He had deliberately chosen not to change. He wanted the world to see the physical evidence of what SkyLink Airlines had done to him. Desmond began speaking, his voice steady and clear. My name is Desmond Clarke. I'm the CEO of Clarke Aviation Technologies. This morning, I boarded SkyLink Airlines Flight 447 in Chicago, heading to the most important business meeting of my career. I had a first-class ticket that I purchased 3 weeks ago for $7,000. I did everything right. I arrived early. I had all my documentation. I was polite and cooperative. And yet, I was dragged off that plane and assaulted by airport security. He paused, letting the words sink in. I wasn't removed for breaking rules. I was removed for being black. He continued, walking reporters through every detail. The suspicious looks at the gate. Bryce Callahan's refusal to check his confirmation email. The way other passengers immediately assumed he was the problem. Kyle and Marcus' excessive force despite his complete cooperation. The humiliation of being held in a security room and told his identification was probably fake. I've spent 30 years overcoming racism to build a successful company. But today proved that no matter how successful I become, there are still people who see my skin color before they see my humanity. Desmond's voice grew stronger. I'm calling for a complete boycott of SkyLink Airlines until they implement real changes. Fire the employees involved. Institute mandatory anti-racism training for all staff. Create an independent oversight committee to review complaints of discrimination. And most importantly, acknowledge that this was racism, not a misunderstanding. The room erupted with questions. Desmond answered them all calmly, methodically, never losing his composure. This was bigger than him now. This was about every black person who had ever been told they didn't belong somewhere they had every right to be. Within 2 hours of the press conference, #BoycottSkyLink became the #1 trending topic worldwide. 5 million people signed a petition demanding the Department of Transportation investigate SkyLink Airlines. The NAACP released a statement supporting Desmond. The ACLU offered legal assistance. Congresswoman Thea Caldwell called for federal hearings. Celebrities began posting their own stories of discrimination on flights. The movement grew exponentially with each passing hour. SkyLink Airlines' stock price began plummeting. By market close, it had dropped 12%, wiping out billions in market value. Financial analysts on Bloomberg and CNBC discussed the scandal's long-term impact. This could be catastrophic for SkyLink, one analyst said. In today's social media age, a racism scandal like this can destroy a brand permanently. Customers began canceling flights by the thousands, demanding refunds. Corporate clients like Google and Microsoft announced they were suspending their contracts with SkyLink for business travel. Franklin Ames held his own press conference, looking haggard and defensive. SkyLink Airlines does not tolerate racism. This was an isolated incident involving employees who did not follow proper procedures, but reporters weren't buying it. Why did your employees drag a paying customer off a plane without checking his documentation? One asked. Franklin stammered through a non-answer. If this was isolated, why are other black passengers coming forward with similar stories? Another reporter pressed. Franklin ended the press conference early, fleeing the podium as questions continued shouting after him. Jasper filed a lawsuit in federal court in Illinois, naming SkyLink Airlines, O'Hare Airport, Kyle Drayton, Marcus Flynn, Bryce Callahan, and Gretchen Hayes as defendants. The complaint sought $100 million in damages for assault, false imprisonment, racial discrimination, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Desmond posted about the lawsuit on social media. This isn't about money. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. Change requires consequences. The consequences came swiftly. SkyLink announced the suspension of Bryce Callahan, Kyle Drayton, and Marcus Flynn pending investigation. Gretchen Hayes was transferred to a desk job, away from customer contact. But public reaction was swift and negative. Suspension isn't enough, people commented. They should be fired and prosecuted. The company's social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. Their customer service phone lines were jammed with people calling to cancel reservations. In just 3 days, SkyLink's revenue dropped 25%. Desmond met with Paulette Dixon, CEO of Delta Airlines, in Atlanta. Paulette was 54, a black woman who had spent her entire career fighting to be taken seriously in the male-dominated, predominantly white airline industry. She understood Desmond's pain intimately. I watched the video 5 times, she told him. I saw myself in you. I've been escorted off planes when crew didn't believe I was a pilot. I've been questioned in airports when wearing my uniform. I know exactly how you felt. They talked for hours about changing the industry from the inside. By the end of the meeting, Desmond and Delta had signed a $15 billion contract. Clarke Aviation Technologies would modernize Delta's entire fleet over 5 years, installing AI systems that would make them the most efficient airline in America. Paulette shook Desmond's hand firmly. This is how we change things. Not just by calling out the bad actors, but by supporting the good ones. Desmond smiled genuinely for the first time since the incident. This was what justice looked like. Not revenge. Progress. While Desmond was building new partnerships, a woman named Lenore Whitman sat in her office at SkyLink Airlines headquarters staring at her computer screen. She had worked in human resources for 20 years, filing reports, processing complaints, maintaining personnel records. She was 56 years old, white, and until this week, she had told herself that the complaints she received about Bryce Callahan were just isolated incidents from overly sensitive passengers. But after watching Desmond Clarke being dragged off that plane, something inside her broke. Lenore had 7 formal complaints in her files about Bryce Callahan. 7 black passengers over 5 years reporting discriminatory treatment, being asked to move seats without justification, being spoken to rudely while white passengers received polite service, being watched suspiciously throughout flights, being questioned about whether their tickets were legitimate. Lenore had documented every complaint. She had forwarded them to her supervisor. And every time, the response had been the same. Bryce was a valuable employee. These were misunderstandings. No action needed. She pulled up an email from 3 years ago. The director of human resources had written, Bryce Callahan has 18 years of experience and excellent performance reviews. We can't afford to lose experienced staff over a few complaints that may or may not be valid. Let's handle this quietly. Lenore stared at those words. Quietly. That was the problem. Everything was always handled quietly. Problems swept under carpets. Patterns ignored. And now a man had been assaulted on camera, and the world was watching. Lenore made a decision that would cost her her job but save her conscience. She copied every email, every complaint, every memo showing that SkyLink Airlines knew about Bryce Callahan's behavior and chose to do nothing. She packaged it all into a folder and sent it anonymously to the New York Times. Then she walked out of her office, drove home, and waited for the explosion. The New York Times published their investigation 3 days later. The headline read, "SkyLink Airlines, a pattern of racism ignored." The article was devastating, meticulously documented with internal emails and complaint records. It showed that Bryce Callahan wasn't an isolated bad employee. He was part of a systemic problem. The airline had received complaints about racial discrimination from 12 different passengers over 3 years. Not just about Bryce, but about multiple employees across different airports. And in every case, the company had chosen to protect the employees rather than address the passengers' concerns. The article quoted from the complaints. A black businessman in Houston reported being told his suit looked too expensive to be real and being questioned about how he purchased his ticket. A black family in Atlanta was removed from a flight because another passenger felt uncomfortable sitting near them with no other justification given. A black woman in Denver was accused of stealing a designer purse that belonged to her and was detained until she could prove purchase. Pattern after pattern after pattern. All ignored. All buried. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. The hashtag SkyLink racism trended globally. Other airlines rushed to distance themselves from SkyLink, issuing statements about their own anti-discrimination policies. United Airlines CEO released a video message. "We stand firmly against racism in all forms. Every passenger deserves dignity and respect." American Airlines announced they were reviewing their own internal practices to ensure nothing similar could happen on their flights. The entire industry was suddenly scrambling to prove they weren't like SkyLink. SkyLink's stock price went into free fall. It dropped another 28% in a single day, bringing the total decline to 40% in 1 week. The company's market value had evaporated by $52 billion. Analysts called it one of the fastest corporate collapses in modern history. This is what happens when systemic racism meets social media accountability, a CNBC commentator observed. There's no hiding anymore. No sweeping things under the rug. Everything is visible now. The board of directors held an emergency meeting. They voted to terminate Franklin Ames immediately, without severance, citing gross negligence in his duties as CEO. Board chairman Preston Langford, a 70-year-old investment banker with silver hair and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, took over as interim CEO. His first action was calling Desmond Clarke directly. "Mr. Clarke, this is Preston Langford. I know our company has harmed you terribly. I want to make this right." Desmond listened to Preston's carefully prepared speech about accountability and change. When Preston finished, Desmond asked one question. "Are you calling me because you genuinely want to address racism in your company, or because your stock price is collapsing?" Preston was silent for several seconds. Then, to his credit, he answered honestly. "Both. I won't lie to you, Mr. Clarke. Yes, we're in crisis. But I've also spent the last week reading complaint after complaint that I should have addressed years ago. Am ashamed. And I want to fix it, if you'll give us the chance." Desmond laid out his conditions. "If you want me to consider any relationship with SkyLink, you do 3 things. 1. Fire everyone involved in my removal. Not suspend. Fire. No severance packages. 2. Issue a public apology on national television acknowledging that what happened was racism, not a misunderstanding. No corporate speak. No legal hedging. Call it what it was. 3. Implement a comprehensive anti-racism program designed and overseen by an independent civil rights organization. Real changes with real accountability. Preston agreed to all three conditions without hesitation. Done. What else? Desmond leaned back in his chair, looking at Jasper, who nodded. I want 49% of the company, and a seat on the board of directors. Preston inhaled sharply. That wasn't a condition. That was a takeover. 49% would make Desmond the single largest shareholder. With effective control of the entire airline, Preston would be handing SkyLink Airlines to the man they had dragged off one of their planes less than 2 weeks ago. After a long pause, Preston spoke. The board will need to vote on this. Desmond stood up, preparing to end the call. You have 48 hours. After that, I'm taking my technology exclusively to Delta, United, and American. And SkyLink can figure out how to compete with airlines using 21st century systems while you're still running 20th century equipment. Preston's voice came through strained. I'll call you back in 24 hours. 20 hours later, Preston called. The board voted, 8-3. We accept your terms. Desmond felt something shift inside him, not triumph exactly, something more complex. He was about to become the largest shareholder in the airline that had humiliated him. He would have the power to reshape it entirely, to make sure what happened to him never happened to anyone else. Send me the paperwork, he said quietly. 1 month after being dragged off Flight 447, Desmond walked into the SkyLink Airlines boardroom as the company's largest shareholder and newest board member. 12 people sat around the polished mahogany table, most of them older white men who had run the airline for decades. They watched him enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled resentment. Preston Langford stood to greet him, shaking his hand firmly. Gentlemen, ladies, this is Desmond Clarke. He now owns 49% of this company. The future of SkyLink Airlines depends on him. Desmond took his seat at the head of the table opposite Preston. He opened his presentation, connecting his laptop to the room's screen. Thank you for welcoming me. Let's be direct. This company is dying. You've lost 40% of your market value. Your customer satisfaction ratings are the lowest in the industry. Your employee morale is non-existent, and your brand is toxic. If we don't make radical changes immediately, SkyLink won't exist in 2 years. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. One older man named Wilbur Gage cleared his throat. Mr. Clarke, some would say your presence here is itself controversial. Perhaps a quieter transition would be better. Desmond looked at Wilbur for a long moment. You mean I should be grateful you're letting me buy my way into the company that assaulted me, and I shouldn't make too many waves? Wilbur reddened, but didn't respond. Desmond continued. Here's what we're going to do. First, we're modernizing the entire fleet using Clarke Aviation Technologies' AI navigation and fuel systems. This will reduce carbon emissions by 50% over 5 years, making us America's first truly green airline. Second, we're implementing mandatory anti-racism training for every employee, designed and supervised by the NAACP and other civil rights organizations. Third, we're creating a diversity committee with real power to investigate complaints and terminate discriminatory employees immediately. Wilbur objected. Mr. Clarke, this plan costs over $3 billion. Where will that money come from? Desmond displayed a spreadsheet. Here's your current financial trajectory. If we do nothing, you'll lose another 30% in value over the next year as customers continue boycotting and corporate clients move to competitors. Total projected loss: $45 billion over 5 years. My plan costs $3 billion up front, but positions us as the industry leader in both technology and social responsibility. Projected revenue increase: $60 billion over 5 years. Net gain: $57 billion. Any questions? The room was silent. Preston looked around the table. "I'm calling for a vote. All in favor of implementing Mr. Clarke's plan." 7 hands went up immediately. After a moment, 2 more joined them. 9-3. Desmond had won. Preston nodded. "The plan is approved, Mr. Clarke. The company is yours to reshape." Desmond felt the weight of that responsibility. He wasn't just changing an airline. He was proving that a black man could take an institution that tried to destroy him and transform it into something better. The changes began immediately. Bryce Callahan, Kyle Drayton, Marcus Flynn, and Gretchen Hayes were terminated. So were 12 other employees with documented discrimination complaints. SkyLink held a press conference where Preston publicly apologized, with Desmond standing beside him. What happened to Desmond Clarke was inexcusable racism, Preston said, using the word clearly and without hedging. "We failed as a company. We protected bad employees, instead of listening to harmed customers. We're changing everything. Starting now." Desmond spoke next. "I didn't want revenge. I wanted transformation. Not just of SkyLink, but of the entire industry. Every person who boards a plane deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race, religion, or background. We're going to prove that an airline can be both profitable and principled." The press conference was carried live on CNN, MSNBC, and major networks. Public reaction was cautiously optimistic. Social media filled with comments like, "Let's see if they actually follow through," and "I'll believe it when I see real changes." Desmond implemented those changes rapidly. He hired 20 new executives focused on diversity and inclusion, most of them people of color with experience in civil rights work. He personally met with employees at every major hub, listening to their concerns and answering their questions. In Dallas, a black flight attendant named Trina Vance told him through tears, "I've worked here for 8 years and never felt safe speaking up when passengers said racist things to me. Management always sided with passengers. Thank you for making this place better." Not everyone was happy. A group of older employees, led by a pilot named Nash Harding, circulated a petition complaining that the company was becoming too political. Desmond met with Nash privately in his office. "Tell me what you mean by too political," Desmond said calmly. Nash shifted in his seat. "All this diversity talk, these new hiring requirements, it feels like you're discriminating against people like me now." Desmond leaned forward. "Nash, treating people equally isn't discrimination against you. It's ending discrimination against others. If that feels uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why." Nash stood to leave, his face red. This company used to be about flying planes, not social justice. Desmond stood as well. "Nash, when I was dragged off one of those planes you love so much, that was about flying planes too. Or rather, about who gets to fly them without being assaulted. If you can't accept that every passenger deserves equal treatment, you're welcome to find employment elsewhere." Nash left, without another word. Desmond learned later that he had resigned, along with 3 other pilots who felt similarly. Desmond didn't lose sleep over it. 3 months after taking control, the results were undeniable. Customer satisfaction scores increased 22%. SkyLink's social media mentions shifted from 90% negative to 65% positive. Corporate clients began returning. Black travelers, who had avoided SkyLink entirely, started booking flights again. Revenue increased 18%. Stock prices climbed 32% from their lowest point, though still below pre-scandal levels. The company was healing. Desmond was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. He was invited to speak at the Global Aviation Conference in Paris. He received awards from the NAACP, the National Urban League, and the Congressional Black Caucus. But the recognition that meant most came from ordinary people. Messages like, Mr. Clarke, I'm a black college student who watched your story. You inspired me to speak up about racism I face on campus. Or, my daughter saw you on TV and said she wants to be a CEO like you someday. 6 months after the incident, Desmond sat in his new office at SkyLink headquarters, looking out over the airport runways. A plane took off, its fuselage bearing the new SkyLink logo. A simple design with the tagline, "Flying Forward, Together." Jasper walked in, grinning. "Just got off the phone with Lufthansa. They want to license our diversity training program for their entire operation. You're changing the whole industry, Des." Desmond smiled. "We're just getting started." His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Mr. Clarke, I'm a flight attendant for a different airline. I just reported racism I witnessed because your story gave me courage. Thank you for showing us we can speak up." Desmond stared at that message for a long time, feeling something he hadn't felt since before that horrible morning in Chicago. Hope. 6 months and 8 days after being dragged off Flight 447, Desmond stood on the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York City, looking out at 2,000 faces. The audience included airline executives, civil rights leaders, college students, and families who had experienced their own encounters with racism. The lights were bright and hot, but Desmond felt calm. He had spent months preparing for this speech, distilling everything he had learned into one message. "Good evening," he began. "My name is Desmond Clarke, and half a year ago, I was violently removed from an airplane for the crime of being black in first class." The audience was completely silent. "I want to tell you what I learned from that experience. I learned that racism doesn't care about your success. I was a billionaire CEO, and they still dragged me off that plane. I learned that individual racism is bad, but systemic racism is worse because it protects the individuals who discriminate. I learned that silence enables injustice." He continued, his voice growing stronger. "But I also learned something else. I learned that we have more power than we think. When I was sitting in that security room, bruised and humiliated, I had a choice. I could accept what happened and move on quietly. Or I could use my platform, my resources, and my rage to change the system. I chose to fight. And here's what happened." He clicked to a slide showing SkyLink's transformation. Diversity statistics, carbon emission reductions, customer satisfaction improvements, revenue growth. This is what accountability looks like. This is what happens when we refuse to accept injustice. SkyLink Airlines went from the most racist airline in America to a model for the entire industry. Not because they suddenly became good people, but because we made discrimination too expensive to maintain. We made equality profitable. And that's the key. He paused, making eye contact with people throughout the hall. Change doesn't come from hoping bad people become good. Change comes from making the cost of injustice higher than the cost of justice. Desmond shared stories from the last 6 months. The black passengers who had written to him saying they felt safe flying SkyLink now, the employees who reported discriminatory behavior that was actually investigated and addressed, the other airlines that had contacted him asking for help implementing similar programs. This isn't just about one company. This is about transformation, from humiliation to revolution, from being a victim to becoming a catalyst. He concluded with the words that had carried him through the darkest moments. Every single person in this room has power. Power to speak up when you witness injustice. Power to support companies that do right and boycott companies that do wrong. Power to transform institutions from the inside. Power to change the world. His voice dropped lower, more intense. They dragged me off that plane thinking they were putting me in my place. Instead, they launched a movement. Never let anyone tell you that you're too small to make a difference. I changed a $50 billion industry. What will you change? The audience erupted. People stood, applauding, some crying. The ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. When it finally died down, Desmond took questions. A young black woman named Ania Floyd, a college sophomore, asked, "Mr. Clarke, when you were being dragged off that plane, did you ever think you wouldn't make it, that they would kill you?" The question hung heavy in the air. Desmond answered honestly. "Yes. I thought about Philando Castile. I thought about Sandra Bland. I thought about every black person killed during encounters with authority. I was terrified. That's why I didn't resist. That's why I kept my hands visible. That's why I spoke calmly. Because I knew that as a black man, any movement could be interpreted as threatening and used to justify violence against me." Another question came from an older white man. "Mr. Clarke, some people say you're being divisive, making everything about race. How do you respond?" Desmond took a breath. "Sir, I didn't make it about race. They made it about race when they pulled me off a plane while white passengers with the same ticket stayed seated. I'm just refusing to pretend it wasn't about race, and that makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to acknowledge that racism still exists. But my comfort matters less than truth." The event ended with a reception. People lined up to meet Desmond, to shake his hand, to thank him. Trina Vance, the SkyLink flight attendant, was there with her family. "Mr. Clarke, my daughter wants to meet you." A little girl, maybe 8 years old, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you the man who changed the airlines?" Desmond knelt down to her level. "I'm the man who tried. But you know what? You can change things too. Never let anyone tell you that you can't." The little girl smiled. "I won't." Later that night, back in his hotel room, Desmond sat alone with his thoughts. His phone was full of messages. Congratulations from friends. Interview requests from journalists. Partnership proposals from companies wanting to work with him. But one message stood out. It was from Luther Hayes, the passenger who had tried to defend him on Flight 447. "Des, I watched your speech online. You did it, man. You actually changed everything. Proud to have witnessed the beginning." Desmond thought about that morning in Chicago. The fear, the humiliation, the pain. And then he thought about everything that came after. The boycotts, the protests, the lawsuit, the board meetings, the policy changes, the lives touched. The systems transformed. Had it been worth it? Yes. 1,000 times yes. Not because he had won, but because he had turned his worst moment into a catalyst for change. His phone buzzed one more time. A news alert. Major U.S. airlines announced joint initiative for racial equity, citing Desmond Clarke and SkyLink Airlines as inspiration. Desmond smiled. The fight wasn't over. Racism wouldn't disappear because one company changed its policies. But momentum was building. Conversations were happening. Systems were being questioned. And that was progress. The next morning, Desmond flew back to California on a SkyLink flight. He sat in seat 2A, the same seat he had been dragged from 6 months earlier. The flight attendant, Felicity Dunn, recognized him immediately. "Mr. Clarke, it's an honor to serve you today. Thank you for everything you've done for this company." Desmond smiled. "Thank you for making passengers like me feel welcome. That's what matters." As the plane climbed through clouds, Desmond looked out the window at the world below, thinking about how far he had come and how far there still was to go. So let me ask you, what do you think about this story? Comment below and tell me. Should more companies be held accountable like this? Have you ever experienced discrimination yourself? What would you have done in Desmond's position? Hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we share powerful true stories like this every week. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. And remember, you have more power than you think. Use it. Thank you for watching, and I hope this story inspires you to stand up for justice wherever you see injustice. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right. Desmond Clarke's story teaches us profound truths about power, resilience, and systemic change. First, racism doesn't disappear with success. No amount of money, education, or achievement shields you from discrimination when prejudice is deeply embedded in systems. Second, silence enables injustice. When bystanders witness discrimination but say nothing, they become complicit. Luther Hayes' attempt to speak up, though unsuccessful in the moment, mattered because it showed Desmond he wasn't alone. Third, accountability requires action, not just apologies. Words mean nothing without concrete policy changes, employee terminations, and structural reforms. Fourth, pain can become purpose. Desmond transformed his humiliation into a catalyst for industry-wide transformation, proving that our worst moments can fuel our greatest contributions. Fifth, economic pressure creates change faster than moral arguments. The boycott, stock collapse, and revenue loss forced SkyLink to act when appeals to decency failed. Sixth, representation matters at decision-making levels. Desmond's presence on the board ensured changes weren't superficial but fundamental. Finally, individual courage inspires collective action. One person, refusing to accept injustice, sparked a movement that changed aviation nationwide. The lesson: never underestimate your power to challenge systems, demand better, and create the change you wish to see. What would you have done in Desmond's situation? Would you have stayed silent or fought back? Comment below and share your thoughts. Have you or someone you know experienced discrimination while traveling? Tell us your story. If you believe accountability matters more than apologies, smash that like button right now. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories of courage and justice like this one. Share this video with friends, family, and anyone who needs to hear that standing up for what's right always matters, even when it's difficult. Thank you for watching and for being part of a community that believes in equality, justice, and human dignity. Remember, change starts with people like you who refuse to look away from injustice. Every view, every share, every conversation you have about this story creates ripples of awareness that can transform our world. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never stop fighting for a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. Until next time, keep making a difference.